we had a lot of interesting things happening in Alaska, didn't we, yesterday? I would say we had a lot of pomp, but not a lot of circumstance. What was the purpose of this meeting between President Trump and President Putin of Russia? So it took place at the Joint Base Elmendorf in Alaska. It was the first U.S. Russia presidential summit since the war in Ukraine started in 2022, and it's also the first time in 10 years that Trump and Putin have met face to face. Now, there's that look of this accused war criminal, Vladimir Putin, who has a arrest warrant out by the International Criminal Court for him, coming to meet with President Trump in the United States, getting feted red carpet treatment, get to ride in the beast, all sorts of fun things. And President Trump seems to be wanting to continue with hugs instead of harsh words strategy. And we set the scene here at the Joint Base Elmendorf. President Trump shows up first. He's got Secretary of State Marco Rubio and his special envoy Steve Witkoff with him. In the Russian delegation shows up next. That, of course, President Putin, his foreign minister Sergei Lavrov, and his version of Steve Witkoff, which is a senior aide named Yuri Ushakov. So this whole thing was highly choreographed. A wanted war criminal being invited into the United States and feted on the red carpet. He got the honor guard, and there was a flyover even of B-2 bombers and U.S. fighters. And they also had F-22 Raptors on the tarmac there, and maybe a couple F-35s, I think. I've seen F-35s flying out of Elmendorf, so they didn't have to bring them in for that. But they certainly weren't just there by chance. Those were there specifically as a photo op. And that's really what this whole thing was. This entire meeting was just political theater. It was, I won't say window dressing. There was more to it than that. And you can learn a lot by looking at how each side wanted to flex, right? For example, the military flyover with B-2 stealth bombers, which were just bombing Iran a few weeks ago, is a serious flex on the part of President Trump. Just like, hey, look what we've got. Mine's bigger than yours kind of thing. And of course, that is meant to project U.S. superiority technologically. And it's a reminder that, hey, we can touch Moscow if we want to. And so the narrative was we're going to have some productive talks on a ceasefire in Ukraine. But when Putin got there, it was like, oh, big military stuff. I don't know if Putin was really all that impressed, or certainly not worried either. But the Russians were flexing too. And specifically, Sergei Lavrov, when he shows up, he's wearing this bright red sweatshirt with the logo of the USSR on it that doesn't exist anymore, the CCCP. And there's been a lot of talk in Russia about reconstituting the Soviet Union. We call it the Soviet reunion. You can tell by looking at President Trump and President Putin. When they get together, they have a thing, a little bromance going. They've got a friendship, to say the least. And if we watch some video of them shaking hands, and of course, they know that the entire world is watching them as they're doing this. So that's not a surprise. You see them here walking. There's the B-2 flyover going overhead. That's a flex if I ever saw one. And they're patting each other on the back and glad-handing and smiling and joking. Then they get in the beast, and look at the smile on Putin. Putin looks like a kid in a candy store. You can see they have an affinity for one another. And especially when they get together face to face, you can tell President Trump is like, hey, this guy's my buddy. And although he has been getting the runaround from Putin since he took office, he has not managed to extract one concession out of Vladimir Putin in all of the attempts he's made. He still is hopeful. He still thinks that maybe somehow he can manage to talk Putin into just laying down his arms or picking up and leaving Ukraine, dangling some business deals in front of him or something like that. Hey, we could do a lot of trade together with you and the United States if you just wanted to stop killing Ukrainians. But it's not happening. And Vladimir Putin came over with no intention whatsoever of agreeing to any sort of peace deal, first of all. giving any concessions to the United States or Ukraine. He made clear in his rambling 15-minute statement, as clear as you could make it in a rambling 15-minute statement that is really calculated to say nothing in 15 minutes of talking. But he made it about as clear as he could that Russia's conditions for ending the war are still pretty much the same. They get to keep the entirety of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson oblasts in Ukraine. And the thing about that is they currently control about 99% of Luhansk Oblast, but they only control about 70% of the other three oblasts. And what they're saying is if you want us to stop fighting and to agree to ceasefire, you have to give us the 30% of those three oblasts that we don't currently control. And that is a complete non-starter for Ukraine. Not only that, you have to understand that by putting a condition that's ahead of their current front lines, but not really on a location like a river or something like that would be easily demarcatable, easily defensible. What happens is they set themselves up for, we need another little bit and another push. Right now, Russia has managed to take some ground over the last few weeks at staggering cost, as usual. There was a supposed breakthrough near Pokrovsk where the Russians actually punched through the lines and made it fairly deep into Ukrainian territory. But the Ukrainians surged over there and cut off the soldiers that were in that pocket. And now those guys are dying very quickly or giving themselves up. And so they're cut off from Russian forces. So it ended up being a net negative for Russia. They did not actually take ground. They lost ground in that and lost a lot of men and equipment doing it. One of the things that, one of the pundits that I follow was mentioning today that I think bears repeating is that if you look at the way that this war is being fought by Russia and Ukraine on the ground, Russia has continued to pursue a Soviet style military strategy, and they have only improvised or only improved their tactics in terms of drone and counter drone defenses. But other than that, they're really still doing it the same way they've always done it. Meanwhile, Ukraine has continued to adapt and improve and innovate, and that innovation is what Russia is sorely lacking. That innovation in terms of drones and unmanned surface vehicles and unmanned aquatic vehicles is really growing under Ukraine to the point where Ukraine is in a much better position today militarily on the battlefield than they were at the beginning of the war or any time since. They have more troops on the field, about 750,000 men under arms, and they are, like I said, they're innovating in so many ways that they didn't have the capacity to do before. So, for example, they are now doing full-on military assaults of Russian trench lines with zero human beings, just cyborg assaults. They've got wheeled, remote controlled, weaponized mini tank kind of vehicles. And they've got, of course, lots of drones. And so there have been several assaults that Ukraine has successfully pulled off in Ukraine with no humans at all. And so what you're seeing is that the Russian casualty rate is staying pretty constant as Russians on a per kilometer basis. For every kilometer Russia takes, it costs them about 300 dead soldiers for every square kilometer. Whereas the death rate among Ukrainian troops is actually steadily declining because they're getting better at protecting their troops and at doing things remotely, even in terms of picking up the wounded and things like that. They now will send a remote piloted vehicle out there that can go out on the battlefield, scoop up a wounded guy, and drive him back to safety of the rear without putting a human medic at risk on the front line, which is astounding. It's really amazing. Not only that, Ukraine was extremely dependent on the United States and Europe to provide them with the ammunition that they needed to continue to fight Russia. Now, Ukraine is actually producing so many munitions inside Ukraine that that they're making more than they need. They're making more than they're using. And that's something you don't hear on the news a whole lot, but that is actually the case. All that to say, as Vladimir Putin is now, he probably doesn't know some of what I just told you because Vladimir Putin is surrounded by yes men. They're going to tell him what they think he wants to hear that will keep his advisors from accidentally falling out of a sixth floor window or committing suicide with 3 shots to the back of his head. So they tend to paint a rosier picture than the truth would dictate on the ground when they brief President Putin. So I don't know how much President Putin actually knows of how badly things have gone on the front lines. But what he does know is how much it's costing him. And he's looking at the balance sheets and saying, at the rate we're going, we're not going to be able to continue paying for this war for a whole lot longer, like in maybe another year. They still have their sovereign wealth fund, but they've been basically living on that. So it's like living on their savings at this point. And the additional sanctions that Trump was threatening against Russia had a serious impact on Vladimir Putin up here. Now, the optics, though, for Russia coming out of it, as I said, are causing Russians to very much celebrate what's happening or what happened in Alaska. First of all, Alaska is symbolic to them because it used to belong to Russia, and there are some people in Russia that would like Alaska to belong to them again. So for Putin to go and meet in Alaska is very low-key flex, and he comes home, no concessions, but he gets at least a reprieve on the secondary sanctions. That's a win for Russia. What did the United States get out of it? We don't really have anything. President Trump is just trying to bring an end to the war, and he's trying to engage with both sides. Now, sadly, unfortunately, in his remarks after meeting with President Putin, President Trump threw Ukraine under the bus yet again. What he said was, look, a deal has to be made. Ukraine is going to have to make a deal. And I don't know why Zelensky doesn't feel like making a deal. He doesn't seem to be disposed to making a deal. I can tell you why Zelensky's not disposed to making a deal, because the deal that's being offered is for Ukraine to lose the war, and losing the war means losing their country, more or less. Now, one other interesting thing that took place at this summit that has gotten a little bit of press was a letter that was delivered to President Putin by President Trump that was written by Melania Trump. And it was a letter asking President Putin to give back the tens of thousands of Ukrainian children that have been stolen by Russia and taken into Russia, and with no intention of ever giving them back. Now, Putin says that those children were moved out of active war zones for their own safety and safekeeping. But in reality, what they've been doing to those kids is they've been saying, you're Russian now, and here's your new family. They're not orphaned. They still have living parents, but they're being told, this is your new Russian family. You're Russian now. Get used to it. And some of those kids have actually been, that are now coming of age, have been put into the Russian army and sent to the front lines to fight against their countrymen in Ukraine. And that is just horrific. Now, I did a documentary about the way that Russia treats Ukrainian citizens in areas that it controls. And I'm going to show you just a small portion of that documentary because I want you to understand why Ukraine is so adamant that they're not going to make a deal with Russia that includes leaving Ukrainians in Russian hands. So take a look at this short documentary and you'll understand why.
This forest I'm walking in just north of Kyiv is a place called Bykivnia, and it's a place that we don't learn about in the United States, but it's very important to the history of the Ukrainians. That's because the Soviet Union used this forest as a dumping ground for more than 200,000 bodies of people that they deemed were not sufficiently loyal to the regime of the Soviet Union. Now, if you think atrocities like that can't happen in today's day and age, the Ukrainians who are suffering under Russian occupation in the south and east of this country would tell you think again. These lists of names written on the walls here in Bikivnia represent just some of the hundreds of thousands of people who were murdered by the Soviet Union and then dumped into mass graves right in this area. And the Russians are again making lists of people in a process called filtration. It's happening all across the occupied areas of Ukraine right now, and it's affecting millions of people. And if you take filtration to its obvious conclusion, what you end up with is another place like Bikivnia.
Someone from Russian soldiers or from FSB, Russian security service, can search your house, can search your phone and look for some photos or messages. They can ask you to show your body, to show your skin. If they don't like you or they find something that they don't like, they make you to go to the next step. It is like some arrest you.
They ask, do you like Ukraine? Do you like Russia? Do you support Russia? What do you think about Russia? What do you think about special operation? And also they try to look in social media and pictures and messengers. So they want to understand and know what people think about.
Everyone was afraid of going through Russia, but it was the only way to get to European countries, and from there back to Ukraine. They made us undress at the checkpoints, looking for tattoos. Sometimes the checkpoints were literally only a few hundred meters apart, but that was nothing. The interrogation was the worst. They brought me to a room with only a metal chair. They looked through my phone, yelling the same questions over and over. I thought I would never get out.
Those chosen from the first filtration are sent to one of dozens of camps around the occupied territory. Here, things get much worse.
They are kept in just unhuman conditions. Very often they have no water, little food, even no water to wash yourself.
Violent interrogation and torture can last for days or weeks, and while some are eventually released, many are sent to the third step of filtration. Russia claims they are filtering out Ukrainian Nazis. What is Russia's definition of a Nazi?
It is anyone who doesn't support the ideas of Russian world.
So anyone who supports Ukraine, basically.
Yes.
Those unlucky ones may never be heard from again. How many Ukrainians have been forcibly relocated to Russia since February?
It is very difficult to identify who are there because Russia doesn't provide anyone with this information. According to the official data, at least 900,000.
Even those who are eventually released are often relocated to remote regions of Russia. Their passports may be confiscated, and only those with resources are able to escape, like these refugees who crossed the Russian border recently into Estonia.
My great-grandfather was a soldier of the Ukrainian rebel army. My great-grandmother also suffered under the Soviets during the Holodomor. It's scary. They all fought and suffered for peace, so it's hard to believe this is happening again.
We are trying to not think about it very much now because everything is relayed onto the psyche of the children, although they don't show it. We can see that it's hard for them. That's why we try to keep everything positive, to not discuss all of this, to not talk about it, as if everything is fine, as if we just changed our place of residence.
You might think that what happens over here in Ukraine doesn't affect you in the United States and has nothing to do with your life. But if there's anything that we can learn from this conflict, it's the message that's written on this stone right here. It says, "The most valuable thing you own is your liberty. And for this, we gave our lives."